a century. It was a year that shifted all of history. 6 billion souls.
On behalf of our lead sponsor, Canadian Bible Society, and our event hosts, Imago and Intricity, welcome to Beauty and Brokenness, a unique opportunity for us to gather to Easter together during this in-between season. As a means of introduction, my name is Alana Walker-Carpenter, and I will be your host. Whether you have a little faith, a lot of faith, or no faith at all, you belong. For those of you who are engaged on social media, our hashtag is Beauty and Brokenness. That's Beauty and Brokenness. And for those of you who'd like to engage in our live Q&A, simply click the right-hand side of your screen, and those questions will come directly to me. I'm delighted to introduce to you our guests. John Franklin, Executive Director, Imago. Dave Addison, Mental Health Advocate, In Between. And Lila Bieli, singer, songwriter, and pianist. Welcome, friends.
Thank you.
So
Let's get started. John, the first question is for you. It's hard to believe that today marks 1 year since our province of Ontario declared a state of emergency. It seems as though everyone has been in between, including all of us. You yourself have been caught in the in-between, having to defer a major arts exhibition, Crossings, from Lent 2021 to Lent 2022. Describe to us some of the challenges you've faced and what we have to look forward to in Crossings.
Yeah, I'll certainly say something about Crossings, but I want to say that for me, as for everyone, Alana, it's been a time of diminished personal engagement. I mean, we just don't have the same opportunities to be together. No Thanksgiving gathering, no Christmas gathering, and so on. And that's not easy. I mean, when we lose that personal contact, that's very challenging. And in my work with our artists, those coffee shop visits, I mean, I miss them, the in-person visits. These are significant absences, but also, as you say, I've been working on this project called Crossings. This was birthed in my own thinking and heart back in the fall of 2018. And I've been living recently in this in-between time where on the one hand, seeing the loss of a vision and yet the possibilities of a reconfiguration of it. Crossings is an international series that focuses on the Stations of the Cross. And what we're doing is commissioning artwork for each of the Stations of the Cross. And in Toronto, we're adding the Triumphal Entry as well as Resurrection. So there will be 16 stations. And it's going to be an all outdoor exhibit. The original way of thinking about it, it was going to be indoor and outdoor, but when it's all outdoor, it raises a lot of challenging questions for us. We do believe that it's going to go ahead and it's going to be a very significant exhibition. And it just happens that this year, and I think over into next year in Toronto, is the year of public art. And so Crossings is going to, in a way, participate in this idea of public art, where people can come and go on a pilgrimage to see these original works that are engaging the scriptural Stations of the Cross.
Thank you, John. And I think we're all longing for those coffee shop conversations. Yeah. And I know I'm looking forward to Crossings 2022. Dave, you have held significant leadership roles within corporate Canada and rose to the top. In it all, you were successful not only because you had a strong skill set, because you asked good questions. You had the capability of finding out what the needs of clients were, but also what their pain points were. Dave, what questions do you think we should be asking ourselves or having others ask of us during this in-between season?
I first am going to unmute so I can ask the questions. The first thing is, am I being in self-care of myself, in body, mind, and spirit? Am I loving myself? And similarly, am I loving those people around me, the people in my life. And I think the big question that we're wrestling with right now is when we check in with other people, that we genuinely ask, how are you doing? With emphasis on the word you, and pausing to get a response. Maybe even change the wording. How are you holding up? I think we can make the assumption that that people may be struggling in some way. And then if we would share when they ask us, how are you? Share some part of our struggle. Be vulnerable in your response. Then it's so much more likely you'll have an authentic conversation and be in a position to support one another.
Some really poignant points. You start first by talking about self-care. And I've been thinking about the passage in the Bible, love your neighbor as yourself. I've never thought about that as yourself. And that's something I've been recently pondering. And Dave, you also shared a couple of other things that are really important for us to consider, not just asking, how are you, but assuming that not necessarily everything is right and reframing that question, how are you holding up? And then lastly, sharing our story authentically with others, sharing a portion of our stories. Thank you, Dave. Lila, for the time you were young and able to play Sesame Street by heart, you have had a natural inclination to music. But your dreams were dashed just like that. Just as you were mapping out going to Juilliard, you were in a car accident, resulting in a 5-year recovery. Describe to us what that season looked like and the silver lining of it all.
Well, it was very confusing. On top of being physically painful and mentally and emotionally, I felt at sea. Now, I know most teenagers are not meant to know, exactly what their life trajectory will be. But as you said, I had mine mapped out. I wanted to be a concert pianist. That was the dream. That was what I was already structuring my life around, building towards that goal. And then the rug got pulled out from under me. And so then I shifted towards the sciences and thought about, what can I do to help people in my position? Because I, even at the time, felt like, gosh, there wasn't a lot of help available to me. So I started looking into occupational therapy and that sort of thing, and psychology as well, therapy, because at that time I didn't really have anyone to talk to except my parents and maybe the odd friend who might be willing to listen. But anyway, fast forward to the silver lining. So I was mostly playing with my left hand, and this felt very limiting because it was my right arm that was injured. And then in being restricted, I discovered my joy of singing and my joy of composing and writing. I had to find a way to continue to express myself as an artist. And that is still, and now, a very big part of who I am in the world and as an artist. And I don't know that I would have really mined those other gifts, if I might call them such, if I hadn't been more limited. So in a way, I'm thankful that things went as they did, although it was hard.
So essentially, Lila, in this in-between season, you were able to discover your true call, the essence of your call. John, this next question is for you, and I always love to throw in a waiting one just for you.
Oh, thanks.
What is the theology of in-between, or shall I say, what is the theology of waiting?
Well, okay, let me give it a shot here. We are, I think we all understand, we're creatures of time. And woven into the fabric of our temporality is the need for waiting. We can't avoid it. The biblical narrative has plenty of examples of how people had to wait. And our lives have plenty of examples of waiting as well. Waiting can be difficult. It can be frustrating, and it can even be painful. And I think it's difficult because it doesn't cater to our self-reliance or our self-sufficiency. In our culture, we're taught that we can be self-sufficient and self-reliant. And waiting really instructs us differently. And we have to realize that we're not running the show and we're not ultimately in control. And waiting also is not only makes life difficult at times, but it's instructive. It can be instructive in a number of ways. It brings us to a posture of dependence. I mean, when you think of waiting, you're really, I mean, if you're a patient or if you're in a line waiting for something, I mean, you have to depend. And there again is a place that we don't particularly like to be. So I think the biblical and theological call here is that we are creatures that are not self-sufficient. We are creatures that are not entirely self-reliant. We have to turn to something bigger and something greater. We pray in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come." There's a waiting that takes place there as well. We have to wait for the kingdom to come. And then I think that also waiting can inspire a spirit of attentiveness, patience, and it also notes our powerlessness. And we don't like that much. That's hard. And that's one of the painful spots. Let me just give you a quotation from Simone Weil. She said, "We do not obtain the most precious gifts by going in search of them, but by waiting for them."
Thank you, John. Waiting instructs us differently. Waiting instructs us differently. And having that posture of dependence when we all like to be fiercely independent. Dave, this next question is for you. Disruption is somewhat familiar to you. You have been disrupted in your professional life, often when your personal values have conflicted with the organizational values. There have been many that have just been disrupted during COVID, resulting in that pink slip. From your own experiences, what words of wisdom would you give to those who are waiting for that next right thing?
Well, I think the first thing is to take pause, to rest, um, and not to get into that place of fear that is so easy to fall into. Um, I think something else that's really important is to not just hit repeat. You know, I've done this in a certain company, this role, and I'm going to I'm going to go and do that same role in another company. Um, you have to look and discern, what are my gifts and what am I called to do? Um, Even maybe as deep a question as, what's my purpose? Um, and I think the other critical thing for me was assessing what my values are and not swaying from those values. So when I'm looking at companies and the people that I meet in this journey to a new opportunity, it's making certain that there's a values alignment. Because if not, you will not be happy, you will not succeed, and you will find yourself in between again. And when you're out connecting with people, we often think about what we can get from them. But if you just turn that on its head 180 degrees and think, what can I do for you? How can I help you? It's just incredible what effect that has on the fruit of those conversations. It's a lot less needy as well, and other focused. So those are a few thoughts.
Taking a pause and resting, how important that is, and not just simply hitting repeat, which is such a great temptation. And you also mentioned so important values. And so often we can get so fixated on vision and mission, but values is often where we're going to conflict or align. And I love that, Dave, that you mentioned. Really, we should be working a room based on what we give, not what we get. What we give, not by what we get. Lila, your 20s was a season of trying to figure yourself out, not just as a musician, but you as an individual. You got absorbed in the world and started to ask life's big questions, including faith. And through a mutual friend, you were able to find an authentic faith. Describe to us how music and faith intersects at this time.
Well, gosh, I mean, I don't think I could exist in the world as I do as a musician without my faith. The two are inextricably intertwined. And I think as a musician who's now getting on in years relative to industry standards, I have to ask myself time and time again why I do what I do. And that inner force, that driving force, is actually less about drive and more about call. Though there's often that tension because I am driven by the desire to achieve, by the desire to be in the spotlight and celebrated and all that stuff. But a friend once said to me that the difference between Mick Jagger and Bono is that Mick Jagger says, "Look at me," and Bono says, "Look past me." And I thought that was really interesting. It stuck with me. And the idea was that for me as an artist, I hope that I can illuminate something much bigger than who I am and the very thing that makes me tick, if I might put it so simply.
Oh, thanks, Lila. I love that. Rather than say, look at me, look behind me. Such powerful words. John, the Saturday between Good Friday and Resurrection Sunday is truly an in-between day. We, as North Americans, often don't know what to do with ourselves, even on that day, still here and now in 2021. Describe to us what it must have been like for the disciples to wait without having that hope of Resurrection Sunday.
Yeah, good question. What was it like on Holy Saturday? I think we're inclined to move quickly from Good Friday to Easter Sunday. And dwelling on Holy Saturday is not easy. Let me characterize that time just a little bit. It was a devastating time. It was a difficult time. And I think it was also a dark time. What had happened the day before was deemed to be a sign of complete failure. A respected leader dies a torturous death and as a common criminal. And they thought that this was a deliverer. How must they feel? Grief of loss would be very deep for particularly for the disciples. Someone they had grown to love was now gone. It would have been a time where hopes were dashed. What are we going to do now? We had hoped for this or for that. And once hopes are dashed, we thought that this person would make a difference in the world. And now what can we hope for? I mean, that's how they must have felt. And then there's the pain of uncertainty. And we all know a little bit about that over this past year or so. We don't know what's next. And so they're living with this pain of uncertainty. And the effort, I think, that they were making to say, what can we do to make sense of this would be another thing that would arise for them. And the experience of isolation and aloneness. They were part of an unfriendly culture. And now the one who was leading them is gone. And then there's the fearful finality of death. And that weighed upon them. So this was a very, devastating, dark, and difficult time for them.
And as I hear you describe that, John, I can't help but think that maybe all of us have been sitting in that Holy Saturday for the last year. Words that you use: devastating, darkness, uncertainty. Thank you, John.
Yeah, I would want to say just quickly that I think in some ways the church is also called to live in Holy Saturday and to speak to a culture that lives in Holy Saturday.
Thank you. Dave, you have not only been disrupted professionally, you have also been disrupted personally. For much of your life, there's the happily ever ending story. But that's not the case with your marriage. And many people right now are sitting in that in between time in their own marriage. What words of comfort would you offer our guests that might be experiencing that very thing?
Well, I find my comfort in my relationship with God. Um, that's He is the true comforter, the Prince of Peace. So that's where I find my comfort, even amidst a storm, and seeking God's will for my life, His path, His perfect plan. Is a place that when I am aligned with that, I'm again going to find peace and comfort. Um, and how do I do that? I spend time each morning in the Word, so reading the Bible. I spend time daily in prayer, and I spend time in fellowship with other believers, having these conversations about life and its struggles. And we, I guess I'd say, do life together. Um, and in another place I find comfort is in serving others, getting out of my own head, my own space, my own struggles. If I'm in a place of self-pity, there's no health in that. So, I've for the last 5 years had a friend, Eileen, who she's 95 years old, and I've been in a strong relationship with her, helping, supporting her independence, keeping her life in living in an apartment alone. She doesn't have family, never married, and so I've been able to help with grocery shopping, running errands, taking her to doctor's appointments, and it's been a joyful thing to be of service. And I'll share. Last week I took her to the hospital for a doctor's appointment, and there was a diagnosis of a lump, a tumor on her bowel, and it's a terminal growth, and she couldn't go back to the apartment. We admitted her to emergency, and yesterday she told me that she's got a few weeks to live. And if you just think about our struggles, and then you put yourself in perspective of life and how precious it is, I'm grateful for every day I have, and being able to be outside of myself, in my struggles. So, yeah.
Dave, you exemplify what it means to be a friend. You talked about how your personal faith was a comfort to you, but you also talked about just getting outside of yourself and helping others. And I just want you to know that you embody that to me, and you have embodied that to all of our guests today. I think an older gentleman in our congregation once said to me, "It's not giving unless it hurts a little," right? We're getting nothing in return. That truly is what giving is about. Lila, your 20s was also a season of great darkness and suicidal ideation. You would show up as this sparkly, spunky person, but deep down inside, Lila, you were crumbling. You were melting down at home, and that was beginning to seep out in public. You started to see a therapist and started to find your way back. What advice would you give others on this call that are experiencing such depth of pain right now?
Well, I think Dave just gave some amazing advice about getting outside of oneself. I mean, it's not a kind term, navel gazing, but it was actually, I saw a few therapists over the years, and it was the one, who sort of said, "What's your depression doing for you?" And I thought, well, that's a cruel thing to say to somebody who's down. But in his unique way, he was encouraging me to step out. And now that I'm a mom, I mean, I still struggle with anxiety and depression. It creeps in now and then. And certainly during pandemic, as a freelance musician who's basically lost all of their, freelance work. And my son, my 10-year-old boy, Josh, is a constant daily reminder that I have a duty to him to look outward, and to, focus on his well-being also. I mean, I understand we've spoken about a few different approaches, and there is that idea you have to put your own oxygen mask on first before you put the oxygen mask on the person next to you. Self-care, loving thy neighbor as thyself, those are all so important. But then, yeah, that other-centeredness as well, which there is receiving and giving, and there is sort of a forward momentum to it as well, where it's easy to feel stuck in times of depression. And just practically speaking, Alana, if I may quickly, I did talk to my family doctor. That was where I started because I didn't know where to go. And she was the one who, recommended a therapist, but she also put me on medication, which was terrifying because I'm also very sensitive in my body. But it did just help me catch my breath. There can be a stigma around meds, especially where our mental health is concerned, but it just helped calm things enough for me to catch my breath and actually gain a little perspective. It stopped that spinning, right? Which can become a cycle or a feedback loop in and of itself. And then the last thing I would say is depression can be so scary and lonely. At that time, I wasn't married. I had my friends. I was in school, but I lived by myself, and it was very deeply lonely. And those were the times when I would sometimes fall into suicidal ideation. And so when I found the courage to reach out and share with a friend and tell them what was actually happening, it was like it broke an unhealthy tie and brought light into the dark. So again, circling back to what we were talking about at the very beginning here, asking people how they're really doing. Like if someone asked me how I was really doing or shared how they were really doing, it was an invitation to share the truth and be seen.
Lila, you've talked about having the courage to share with that friend. Well, thank you for having the courage to share with all of us today. And, you've given us permission to do what we need to do, whether it's depression or whether it's something else, to catch our breath, how important it is for us to catch our breath. John, Lent is about waiting. COVID has been about waiting, yet we struggle. We are in a culture of hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, not slow down. What has COVID taught us as a society?
Well, that's a good question, Alana. It's also a question of what are we willing to learn? It's very easy to slip back into our own old habits, but there's much to learn, I think, from the experience of the pandemic. We've been reminded that we're social animals. I think we know that to some extent, but it's been a very deep reminder that we need one another. So I think that's one thing that we've learned. Relationship is at the heart of our humanity. We need to understand that. And what we've heard from Lila and Dave here, I think, illustrate that wonderfully. And when it's lost, it impacts us. That is, when relationship is lost, it impacts us. But we also know, I think, or could have learned, that the frantic pace of life that so many of us engage in, that we take up, is neither necessary nor is it fulfilling. I think that's a good lesson from the pandemic. Perhaps we learn that our frantic pace of life is really an escape, a denial, are running away from what is more significant for our health and for our well-being. And I think being set apart, a kind of forced sabbatical that we've all had during the pandemic, can be very fruitful in instructing us in these things. So I hope that we may have a fresh perspective also on the gifts of life. We need to learn to savor the wonderful gifts that we have in relationships, in family, in friends, in the world of nature, certainly in the places of quiet and the enriching presence of the arts. I need to say that, of course, and the value of silence and of listening. I mean, these are things I think we can learn from the pandemic. And we may also finally have learned something about the virtue of patience.
Thank you, John. I loved that reminder about just the high value of silence and of listening and the fresh perspective we have as we re-enter in. Dave, no matter the level of success, it just wasn't enough, including that corner office. You began to self-medicate and binge drink. It wasn't just 1 or 2 drinks. It was 10 or 12 drinks. You would start with 3 beers, you would move to a bottle of wine, then to 3 or 4 rye and gingers. And if you hadn't numbed out, you'd add a port or a sherry on top of that. You were unfulfilled, unhappy, and waiting that you were unexpectedly met with something else. Describe to us what that was.
Well, I think first, like Lila, I was in a place where I'd actually lost the will to live, and I thought that I would have a premature death because of the lifestyle choices that I was making. But I was okay with that because of that darkness that I felt. In the spring of 2010, I had a psychotic break, and it actually manifested as a manic episode that lasted a number of months. But out of that came a spiritual awakening, and it was February 1st of 2010 when I just fell on my knees and I threw the keys to Jesus. I guess I was going to drive the bus off the cliff, and I just had enough, and I just said, take over. And it was 2 weeks later that I had my last drink, and just February 16th passed. I celebrated 11 years of sobriety. I did have a diagnosis of bipolar 1, and then like Lila, I got support, made a number of lifestyle changes around diet and exercise, vitamins and supplements, and then went on a mild mood stabilizer as well. And all of these things together brought me to a place of remission. I haven't had another manic or depressive episode since that time in 2010. And then after that period of healing, it was a decision what to do. And I took a 180 pivot professionally, and I became the executive director of Toronto City Mission. So it set me on a whole new path.
Dave, that story is just so hope-filled, so hope-filled. Lila, you just hit 40. You just turned 40, I think last fall. Yay. You look amazing, girlfriend, for 40. Well, you established yourself as a musician in your 20s and 30s. There were, which included receiving a Juno in 2019. You were still forced with naysayers and critics. How do you deal with those opposed as you are waiting for the next right thing?
It can be hard to avoid these phrases that can sound a little cliche, but this is one I've held on to for as long as I can remember. Audience of one. So obviously everybody is, my listener base, anyone my music reaches, I care about everybody. But that could be overwhelming. And although, anyone out there, if you look at the whole group, it's like it includes people who are cheering me on as an artist, and also the naysayers, those who said, you can't do this, you shouldn't do this. And I've had both, at many junctures along my career path. And so I, had to always go back to a place of asking God, what is the call? Why am I doing this? Should I be doing this? And put even my career at the altar, which is so hard to do, especially when you've invested, 20 plus years in it, and it feels very precious. And so I think that, and sorry, Alana, I've also, and you and I talked about this one-on-one, been interested in this idea of an even keel, or what the Bible calls meekness. And I would also be interested to know what John would have to say about this idea of being meek. But it's, to my understanding, this picture of the even keel, and not being, sort of built up by the praise of man, nor cast down by the criticism of man. And so if you sort of stay along that straight and narrow path, then it's easy not to get distracted by the things that, for me, don't really matter in the end. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, there's some ambiguity, but that's okay. But what I love that you said, Lila, is the audience of one. And I hold to that.
Yeah.
Right? Especially when there's all these different stakeholders, the champions, the critiquers, it's an audience of one.
Yeah.
John, at the heart of spirituality is to enter into each other's lives, to show up, to be fully present. But yet there is this temptation to cure, to fix, rather to extend care and compassion. How do we wait well with others and fight the temptation to fix, to control, to manage?
That's a good and challenging question, Alana. I think what really we need is a paradigm shift in how we understand ourselves as human beings. I think we often get drunk with power and our own capabilities and what we're able to do. We can set the world right. I can fix my own life. Thank you very much. We have that sort of attitude, but I think what the biblical narrative teaches us is that that's not true. That's just not true. And that the Lila mentioned meekness. Meekness is actually something deep and very strong, but it's the opposite of being drunk with power. It has a humility of spirit, a self-giving. And so really what the biblical narrative does is turn the world upside down. It's really weakness that is more powerful than strength, as it were. I mean, it's so we need a paradigm shift, and I think a belief that it's not in our hands to fix everything in the world, that we can simply sit alongside somebody and be in relationship with them, and that's hugely significant in a particular moment.
I agree. There is something so powerful just sitting with somebody in silence and just being, simply being. Dave, your journey has brought you to a really unique place in which you're able to take your own experiences and the experiences of others to create and shape a role of mental health advocate for corporate Canada. What does this role look like, and why is it, Dave, so desperately needed?
Yeah, the most important asset a company would have is its people, and so how do we care for our employees, and in particular their mental health? And I'm just a strong believer that you can't outsource that responsibility to someone else. Like an EAP firm, here's a 1-800 number. The managers, the leaders have a responsibility to have those relationships with the employees. So I see myself in a position to normalize the conversations about mental health without fear of it being career limiting. And I see that should be all the way up to the C-suite of the company. It's possible to have peer support within a business where people would come alongside each other when they're at different stages of a journey with mental health. It's really about a cultural shift in a company to be one that is supporting of the whole person. And if I could be so bold as to maybe say that a value the company would have is compassion and love for the employee.
I love that value, compassion and love. I'd love to see love as part of everybody's values in corporate Canada. And, you know, the culture shift that we all need to make, and to normalize this conversation. I love the fact that we have Bell Let's Talk Day, but I'd love to create a hashtag more than a day, because the conversation of mental health can't just be limited to one day. It needs to be a conversation that we're having 365 days a year. Lila, this last question is for you. You have been nominated for another Juno Award for Out of Dust. Congratulations. We're super excited. It was the album that we all listened to as we were waiting for the session to start. The album was written in a season of waiting. And despite the recommendations of others to hold that album, you insisted that it needed to be released during COVID. Explain to us why you felt so compelled to release it.
Well, you know, I felt that in some ways the release of the album couldn't have been better timed, even though many would have argued it couldn't have been worse timed. It was right at the outset of the pandemic, or a couple of weeks in, March 27th of last year. And my sense was that the journey of those songs, which in large part are from, you know, darkness to light, brokenness to hope, would, I hoped, I prayed, speak to people when they needed that message. And I think, you know, art has many places and functions in the world, but for me personally, it's to connect and to tell my story and my experience in a way that's authentic and will hopefully reach those around me and encourage them in their journey. And yeah, so against the recommendations of my team, I proceeded, and I'm glad I did.
So, bringing us from darkness to light. Well, friends, our time together has come to an end, and I want to start by thanking the Canadian Bible Society for being our lead sponsor and collaborating with us for Beauty and Brokenness, A Journey to Easter. And I also want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our panelists today, for John and Dave and Lila, for their raw and honest insights and just the courage and bravery that all three of them have had to show up today with. Thank you. This session has been recorded and will be on both of our websites. So that's www.imago/arts.org or www.intricity.ca. We invite you to our final session on Wednesday, March 31st on being hopeful, where John, the executive director of Imago, will join us once again. And with John, we will welcome Scott Cameron, chairman, CEO, and founder of Cameron Stephen Mortgage Capital, and Timothy Schmaltz, a well-known sculptor. We invite you to consider attending the Ontario Prayer Breakfast on Monday, March 29th, the launch of Holy Week. Complimentary tickets can be found at www.ontarioprayerbreakfast.ca. And we invite you to save the date for Crossings 2022. And more information can be found at www.crossingstoronto. And lastly, as both John and Lila expressed, this has been a difficult season for artists. So we invite you to consider purchasing one of Lila's albums at www.lilabayeli.com. So friends, our in-between seasons can be long, they can be painful, they can be excruciating, and they can be lonely. I found myself reflecting on the first disciples and the agonizing of waiting on that Holy Saturday. And so, as we continue our journey to Easter, from that Holy Saturday to Resurrection Sunday, know that God is waiting with you in this in between season. Thank you for joining us.
Come on down when you hear that sound. Come on down, there's a fire underground. Come on down when you hear that sound. Come on down, there's a fire blowing round. 16th year of the 21st century.